when the police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street and presented Rose with the warrant. She became pale and hysterical, screaming to her eldest son, Stephen, to get Fred. The police also noted that Rose was doing a lot of doublespeak when discussing Heather's disappearance, eventually becoming abusive with the officers when they pointed out the contradictions in her stories. Fred had been working in the town of Stroud that day, and upon learning what was going down at the house, he assured his son Stephen that he would be home shortly, and it would be 3 hours before he arrived home, at which time he informed the family that he would voluntarily offer a witness statement to police regarding Heather's whereabouts. And in this statement, he said that she was alive and well, although involved with a drug cartel, further adding that the story of Heather being buried beneath the patio were rubbish. This did little to dissuade the police, who continued pressing him, to which Fred eventually exploded and said that they were holding a grudge against him for the acquittal of the previous year. According to Stephen West, when the search team left their house that evening, he observed both of his parents talking in hushed tones while they glanced back at the garden. He saw this from an upstairs window. The next morning, when Stephen was getting ready for work, he was confronted by his father, Fred, who informed him that he needed to take care of his mother and sell the house, and that he should go to the papers and try and make as much money as possible, as he had done something really horrible. When the police arrived a few hours later, Fred told them that he wanted to be arrested for Heather's murder and to be taken to the police station where he would provide a full confession. At 11:15 that morning, Fred admitted to police that he had killed Heather, claiming it was an act of manslaughter. He said that he strangled Heather in a fit of rage, then dismembered her body in the ground floor bathroom with a heavily serrated knife he normally used for cutting slabs of frozen meat. Her remains had been stored in a dustbin as he waited for an opportunity to dig her grave. He insisted that Rose had no knowledge of Heather's murder, claiming he had committed the murder as Rose was dealing with one of her clients. One of the things that came out during all of this was that Rose was a prostitute, and there was an entire floor in the house that was strictly known as Rose's room, where she would take people from the area who came to partake of her services, and Fred would videotape a lot of these acts, and also there were peepholes in the wall through which he could watch his wife engaging in sex acts. One of the things of interest in this case is that a lot of Rose's clients were politicians and members of the local police force. And there has been some speculation, although little proof to back any of this up, that one of the reasons that it took so long for the West family to be found out was because the government already knew what they were up to, but because of the business Rose was running and because so many of her clients were in the government, they turned a blind eye to it. At the police station, Fred went on to state that the reason the team had yet to find Heather's remains was because they were looking in the wrong part of the garden. He offered to go back to 25 Cromwell Street with the officers and show them exactly where it is that they could find Heather's body. The children had various responses to the news that their father had confessed to Heather's murder. Some of them entered a state of shock and refused to believe it, while others simply shut down. The next day, which was February 26th, the police began excavating the area of the garden that Fred had stated he buried Heather at, and late in the afternoon, a human thigh bone was found protruding from a section of the garden that Fred insisted police did not need to look in. While further along, in the area Fred had indicated Heather was in, they discovered a mass of human remains encased in a bin bag intertwined with 2 lengths of rope. The police took the remains with them to headquarters, where they were determined to belong to a young woman. Various bones were missing from these remains, and they were never found. One thing of note is that the fingernails of this victim were found in a pile, which suggested to the police that they may have been torn from the fingers as a means of torture, which gives us a little bit of insight at this point as to the nature of the man police had in custody, Fred West. But we're going to see this was the least of the atrocities that Fred committed. Anyways, later that night, the remains were formally identified as those of Heather West. That night, Fred was formally charged with Heather's murder, and the police questioned him as to why they had found another thigh bone in the garden. And eventually, Fred admitted that there were 2 other victims buried in the garden, and stated he would go back with police to show them where exactly he had buried the 2 of them. Fred said that one of the victims was a woman named Shirley Robinson, who had been a lesbian tenant of theirs, who had also been pregnant with his child at the time of her 1978 murder, and that the other victim was Shirley's mate. The next day, on the 28th, the police found 2 sets of remains, one of which the thigh bone they had found the previous day was a part of. Fred was charged that evening with 2 further counts of murder. At this point, we're going to shift the focus of our narrative from the crimes to Fred and Rose West themselves. This is because his victims were known to both Fred and Rose, and in order to understand how they fit into the overall picture, we have to see where they come into their lives as far as a timeline goes. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on September 29, 1941, at Bickerton Cottage, Muchmarkel, Hertfordshire. He was the first surviving child born to Walter Stephen West and Daisy Hannah Hill. The Wests were a poor farming family. It's been said that Walter West was a strict disciplinarian, while his wife Daisy was overprotective of her children. In 1946, the family moved to Moorcourt Cottage at Moorcourt Farm, where Walter West worked as a milking herdsman and a harvest hand. Moorcourt Cottage had no electricity and was heated by a log fireplace. I have also read that there was no indoor plumbing and that the family had to use an outhouse. At any rate, by 1951, Hannah West had given birth to 8 children, 6 of whom survived. And while Fred was seen as the favorite of Hannah and a mother's boy, he looked to his siblings for companionship. All of the West children were expected to work on the farm alongside their father. Because of this, Fred developed an extremely strong work ethic. Fred's classmates have described him as dim, scruffy, lethargic, and stated that Fred was regularly in trouble. In fact, around this time, he began a lifelong obsession with petty theft. Fred was known around town to be very skilled at woodworking and other manual labor. When he left school at the age of 15, he was scarcely literate. Now, during interviews with police, he claimed that he had been introduced to sex by his mother, to have engaged in acts of bestiality with animals in his early teens, and that his belief in incest stemmed from his father claiming that it was a normal activity that all fathers partook in. These claims, however, were refuted by Fred's younger brother, Doug, and Doug said in part that it was all fantasy in Fred's mind. None of these things ever happened. What is known is that by 1957, Fred and his brother John began to frequent a social youth club in nearby Ledbury, where Fred's Hertfordshire accent marked him as a country bumpkin. Now, people who were in the area at the time remember Fred as being aggressive towards the young women who used to go to this social club and other areas that teenagers hung out in. He was constantly pestering them, with some saying that it was apparent that Fred had objectified women and saw them as nothing more than sex objects. He was known on the local scene as someone who would walk up to a girl and just suddenly start fondling her, no matter who was around or what was said in objection to this. So we can already see some sexual deviancy starting to come to the forefront in Fred's life, but it was to get worse. At the age of 17, he bought a motorcycle, much to his mother's chagrin, and 2 months after purchasing it, he suffered a fractured skull, a broken arm, and a broken leg in an accident. Now, the story I have read is that Fred was trying to pester a girl who had accused him of rape, and that he in fact had tried to run her down on the motorcycle and ended up getting into an accident because of this. He was unconscious for 7 days and walked with braces for a number of months afterwards, and it's been said that he began to show an extreme shift in personality after this accident. He would never willingly go back to a hospital after this, and he also had fits of rage that came out of nowhere. He would suffer another head injury 2 years later when, out on a fire escape, he attempted to grope a girl, and she either punched or shoved him, and he fell off of this fire escape, falling 2 floors before hitting the ground. In December of 1960, Fred began molesting his 12-year-old sister, Kitty, and in June of the following year, Kitty, now aged 13, confided to her mother that he had been raping her and that she had become pregnant. Fred was arrested that month, and he freely admitted to the actions he had taken against his sister, stating, "Doesn't everybody do it?" He was thrown out of the house because of this, although his mother, Daisy, was prepared to testify in his defense. The case eventually collapsed, and Fred ended up moving in with an aunt in the village of Muchmarkle. By the next year, however, he had reconciled with his family and moved back in with them, although many of his family members had disowned him because of this incident. Now, in 1960, a woman named Catherine Rena Castillo had come into Fred's life. She was from Coatbridge, Lancashire, and she had met Fred at a dance hall in 1960. The two of them had dated for a few months, and it was known that she dabbled on the side in prostitution. Now, in September of 1962, she came back to Muchmarkle, pregnant with the child of a Pakistani bus driver. It's been speculated that she had left home this time because Her family were displeased that she was set to have